thank you for attending our webinar today. We look forward to sharing with you information about the 2019 version of ISO 22301 that is being published very soon. Thank you for joining. I'm your presenter today, and my name is Linda Nelson. I am the ICOR president, and I have been an expert member of the technical committee for ISO 22301 as well as these other standards listed here since 2011. I just returned from our meeting in Delft on Friday where we finished our review, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that. Our webinar objective today is to gain an understanding of the changes being made to ISO 22301 and a little bit about why they're being made. As a reminder, the recording of the webinar will be available on the ICOR webinar page in 2 days. We usually have it up by Friday. So if you wanted to watch it again or to share it with someone else, you'll be able to do that probably by Friday afternoon. And if you have any questions, use the questions button. You can I'll either try to answer those questions during the webinar if we have time, or I'll be replying after the webinar. I'll send an email to all the attendees, and I'll answer your questions then as well. I also wanted to let you know that there is a handout available that you should be able to download the handout. So there is a summary of the changes that were made and why. That's included there, and you can download that as well. I'd like to go ahead and take our first poll. I know people are still logging in, but one of the things I want to be able to understand is who is actually attending today. So what is your understanding of the standard, the 2012 version, and how have you used it since 2012? So Brandy's going to go ahead and open that poll for us. All right, I think we can go ahead and close the poll, Brandy.
The answers are still coming in pretty steadily, so I'm going to wait just a couple more seconds there for you.
I know that people are literally logging in right now. We can see attendees being added.
Okay, it looks like it's slowing down. I'm going to wait about 5 more seconds. Okay, I've closed that poll, and here are our results.
So that's really interesting. It's great to see that 35% of you are familiar with the requirements and use the standard. I'm actually working on a blog on a similar topic, and one of the things that I just got from the ISO website was a study that they've done from 2014 to 2017 to show how many companies are certified. And the next one's going to be coming out in August of 2019, so we'll have an updated version coming soon. But it's surprising to me how few companies in North and South America are certified. It seems that the largest number of companies are certified in Asia as well as in Europe. I mean, I'm not just talking a little bit difference. I'm talking about thousands of difference in the numbers of companies certified. So not sure where you all are coming from, where you're located, but if you're from the United States and you're using the standard, that's great. And I know that there's a difference between using the standard for alignment than being certified to the standard, so I should qualify that as well. But it is nice to see that about 75% of you are familiar with the standard, and the rest of you are working on becoming more familiar. All right, I'm going to go ahead and continue on. I wanted to share first a little bit about the standard process and how standards get written. So I'm sharing how they get updated with this version. So one of the rules that you have is that a management system standard has to be renewed every 7 years, and it usually takes about 2 years of work to get a standard renewed. So our deadline for publishing ISO 22301, the 2019 version, is December of 2019. So we are on a schedule. So in June of 2017, the current standard, the 2012 version, went out for review globally. And one of the things that I-Corps did was we sent out through our LinkedIn as well as through eBlast the form and the standard and said, provide your input. Share with us what you struggle with implementing. How do you struggle with, maybe doing an internal audit or a self-assessment? What are the things that you really like that you feel are really strong? And we consolidated those comments as well as we asked the same thing of our students who had completed either the lead implementer or the lead auditor course. And we took those comments and we shared those as part of the U.S. comments. So those comments went out in June, and then that review is called, they have formal names for things, it's called a Committee Draft 1. So we met officially for the first time in March of 2018, and each member body or each country compiles their comments. So for example, in the U.S., all the experts send their comments in to our leadership, which was at that time ASIS, and then we meet and we decide which comments are going to be submitted to ISO. So not everybody's comments. So for example, maybe I sent in 20 comments, and the U.S. as a whole, all of our experts said there's 3 of them that didn't agree with. So those 3 wouldn't have been included. And that's the process that's followed through each country. And so we reviewed those comments in Australia, and I can't remember the number of them, but there was 150 pages of comments. It was a ton of comments. So we went through most of those, and then in April and May following, we did conference calls to finish up with the comments because we weren't able to finish them over the 4 days that we met. And the result of that review is called Committee Draft 2. Then that went out for review following the same process. And then October of 2008, we met in Norway. And those comments were reviewed, and then that became a draft international standard, and that was published in 2019, and then it went out for review again. So the comments that came in from January through March of 2019 were submitted, and we met in Delft in the Netherlands last week to review those comments, and what's now being published is called the Final Draft International Standard. And so just to confirm, there still may be changes that are going to be made by ISO, but they're probably going to be editorial changes, because once we publish the Final Draft International Standard, it's supposed to be final. And other than editorial changes made by ISO, the content for the most part should remain the same, and that's why I felt pretty safe in sharing this information today. So we expect the final version to be published. It'll be voted on in September in Thailand, and hopefully the final version will be published in October. We are sort of at the discrimination of ISO and how long it takes them to get it written and get it published. But sometimes they come out right away within a couple of weeks, and other times they take a couple of months. So this is just our guesstimate. We are also working on the guidance document, understanding that you can't write your guidance in completion until the requirements are done. So we've been working side by side, and they have the same deadline of December 2019. So most of September's meeting in Bangkok will be focused on providing that final draft international standard for the guidance document as well, with the tentative date of December 2019 for publishing that document. So there's different parts of a standard, and so we are not going to talk today about the front matter. There were tons of changes made to the introduction, for example, and to the terms and definitions. That's a whole several hours in discussion itself. What we are going to be doing is focusing on the requirements aspect, which is clauses 4 through 10, with clause 8 under operation containing the bulk of the requirements. I wanted to also bring up this idea of blue text. In 2011-12, ISO created a template. At that time was called Annex SL, but is now called Annex L. and it was a template that we needed to use for all management system standards. And ISO 22301 was the first standard to follow that template. So since then, of course, they've improved their template, and it's also called the high-level structure, or HLS. And so this blue text can't be altered. We can add text to it, but we can't remove anything. And one of the challenges was that this text was updated on May 1st, 2019. So between the time when we collected all of our comments and when we met in Delft last week, we had to actually implement changes to the blue text into our current document. So we kind of say this with a smile, but sometimes this requirement is frustrating. It really is there for the best reasons. It's just they undergo changes as well, and then we have to keep up with those changes too. One thing just to make note of, the content not changed at all will not be discussed, and I'm going to show you a few examples of where just the editing has been changed, just to give you an idea of what it looks like, even though the content itself and the requirements haven't changed. And then just reminding you that there is a Word document under your handouts that you can download so that you can view the 2012 version, what the 2019 version may look like, which, just as a reminder, it may not be final, and then the reasons for those changes. We made some changes overall to the entire document when we looked at the document as a whole for editing purposes. So one of the things that we did was we removed and consolidated duplicate requirements. So I said earlier, for example, some companies, people say, how many shall statements, S-H-A-L-L statements are there in the standard? And somebody will come up with one number because they just go through and they count the number of times they see the word shall. But in reality, what we had in the 2012 version were requirements that were written in more than one place. So you could meet that requirement and it might tick off 6 shalls, for example. So what we've tried to do is to really make the standard more efficient and more readable and to remove the confusion of duplicate requirements. And what we did was we looked at where would this requirement best go? We see it in these 3 places. Where should we put it? And that was a lot of the discussion we had back in Sydney in March of 2018. One of the big wins that we felt that we had is that our technical committee went to ISO and said, we want to make sure that every requirement has a bullet or a number, not just it needs to be numbered, like a letter A or a number 1, not just one of those slashes or bullets, because it was very, very difficult to reference a requirement. You had to write the whole requirement out because it didn't have a letter or a number. We also looked at any requirement that had lots of requirements mixed into it. So maybe it was one sentence and had 4 requirements. We changed those into bullets as well to make it easier to reference and easier to implement. Another global change we made was to change establish, implement, and maintain to just implement and maintain. Just made it easier to read. We also wanted to make it clear, this might not mean anything to you, but clauses 4 through 7 and 9 through 10 are really about your management system. And we wanted to be really clear that this refers to the system where your business continuity program is sitting. And clause 8 has to do with business continuity. So if you look at other ISO standards, what you're going to see is this blue text, and clauses 4 through 7 and 9 and 10 might look actually exactly the same from standard to standard with just a few different changes. And clause 8 is going to be where all your content is and where you're going to see a lot of difference. So what we're doing is we didn't use business continuity program anymore. We just said BCMS or business continuity. The one term I want to discuss is on risk appetite. We tried very hard to not use what we call jargon or acronyms or terms, but to use the words that describe them, in other words, plain English. But we had the word and the term risk appetite was used, I think, 4 or 6 times in the standard. So this was replaced with the phrase, the amount and type of risk that the organization may or may not take, or the amount and type of risk that it may not take, depending on the reference. So that's something that you'll see new. It's not a new requirement. It's just a new way of stating risk appetite. So let's go ahead and get started with Clause 4, the context of the organization. This very first clause says that you need to understand your organization and its context. You need to understand the external and internal issues. And here they're using the word issues to mean what I would normally say is risks. And so you need to understand, what kinds of risks the organization faces, what the organization does, and again, the type of risk that it may or may not take, which is a blue text in the note. Then we had a lot of other text, and you notice we had an ABC, as well as the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And what we found was that all of this content was in other clauses. So we just either moved it to the clause that we felt it fit better in, or just removed it because it was already listed somewhere else. What we did add was the note that these issues are going to be influenced by the organization's overall objectives, its products and services, and again, the amount and type of risk it may not take. So that was how the note looks, which is a little bit new. And again, it's blue text, so it's interesting that we had it listed in bullets before, and now it's a note, so we just left it there. Just another really little editorial thing here, like nothing changed to 4.21, we just got rid of the example. So we looked hard and fast at each one of the examples that we gave to see if they were necessary or not. In this case, we decided it wasn't necessary. Most of management system standards do not have legal and regulatory requirements. We didn't make any changes. This is one that's an example of how we did an editorial change. So we took the 3 sentences and we made them into 3 bullets. The only thing that changed was the part that's struck out there, which is new or variations to legal and regulatory and other requirements shall be communicated to affected employees and other interested parties. It was really, in several different countries, experts' opinion, that legal and regulatory requirements are going to be required outside of your BCMS, and the communication of that's going to be determined by other policy, and it didn't need to be included in this standard. So while you still should be communicating changes, they didn't want to make it a requirement within ISO 22301. The scope of the BCMS was reduced significantly. Didn't really change the number of requirements because the requirements are within other parts of the standard, but you still need to establish the parts to be included, and then you're also taking into account its location, size, nature, and complexity, which is kind of combining bullets A and E. And then you need to identify the products and services included in the BCMS, which was letter C. The B was removed, and D was removed because we felt that they were actually included in A and B, that when you need to take into account these things and identify the products and services. So we really just simplified this to be 2 bullets. Leadership was one of the largest and longest clauses, and you'll see here that it's all blue text under 5.1, so we can't remove any of it, and I don't think we wanted to remove any of it. But here what I've highlighted in yellow is what ISO has made as a change to the blue text. So under letter D, they added management to business continuity, and we wanted it just business continuity. And you can see that it refers to those BCMS requirements. And then we're not really understanding why letter H, they changed management to managerial roles. So we don't know. We've put in a proposal to ISO to say we would like management taken out of letter D, and we would like management to be put back in H and not managerial. But we can't make changes to this high-level text. So we've requested it, but we don't know if it'll change or not. So we really will have to see in September what the outcome of our request is. There was a lot of other text under 5.2. All of this has been removed. None of it was blue text. And this was removed because it was already listed somewhere else. And we literally found each one of those things somewhere else. And so we moved them and removed them from here. Because we removed 5.2, that policy is now 5.2 instead of 5.3. And we mostly did editorial changes to this, and they were mostly blue text. So things that we had submitted as requested changes in 2018 were actually changed in what came out in the May 1st document. And so you can see we have a new header. So we've got two headers under 5.21, one that says establishing the business continuity policy, and then we made a second header communicating the business continuity policy, because if we didn't have those two headers or subjects in those bullets, then we would have duplicate letters A, B, and C. And we didn't want to have duplicates. It would have made it very hard, again, to refer to things. The two requirements were removed. One was to be reviewed for continuing suitability, and this was because that's a requirement under 9.1. And of course, your policy needs to be documented. This is a requirement under 7.5, so it was removed from here. I want to talk just for a minute about Clause 6. If you're familiar with other management system standards, this is where ISO 22301 is different from those standards, because some of the standards deal with project risk and program risk within here, which it should be. But remember that under ISO 22301, we're also looking at risk to the organization in Clause 8. And so we wanted to be very clear what the purpose of Clause 6 was. So there weren't any changes to 6.1, but 6.2, we changed the word plans to planning. We didn't want people to think that we're talking about business continuity plans. This is the planning that goes into writing the plans. I have a little joke that says, planning the plans. And that's really what we're trying to do here is, what is your planning for your program? As a business continuity professional, what are you doing day to day in your job to improve your business continuity program and the business continuity management system itself? Letter B was very confusing because this is actually something that belongs in Clause 8, the identification of your minimum level of products and services and taking that into account. That's something that you need to do take into account when you're identifying your strategies and your solutions. So this was removed from here. And then letter E was actually changed into two bullets to be monitored and be updated. And then we added to be communicated as well. So there's just a few modifications into 6.2. And just as a reminder, this clause, its purpose is on planning for business continuity. It's the project management that you're doing. That's a result of developing and maintaining your business continuity program. What is brand new is Clause 6.3. So there's been some pushback on this, but we decided to leave it in and see how it's implemented. The technical committee really felt that managing change to the BCMS was not a strong enough focus of the standard. It is in clauses 9 and 10, a little bit in clause 8.1, but we wanted to really make sure that the practitioner understood that you need to manage change to the BCMS. And when you're managing those change, you need to be doing that in a planned manner. So you're going to need to now prove, if you're going for certification, how you're managing changes. And when you're doing that, you shall consider. So the shall consider is kind of an interesting phrase, that you need to consider these things. You need to be able to prove that you've considered them. So what are the purpose of the changes, and what are their potential consequences? So when we make this change, how is it going to impact the whole BCMS? How is it going to impact the integrity of the BCMS? And what happens when you have either more resources or you have less resources? How does that impact your BCMS? And if people have been allocated or reallocated different responsibilities and authorities, how does that impact your BCMS? So all of a sudden, if we hear this all the time. Yeah, we had another reorg, and all of a sudden, the people that were that you've trained and have responsibility for your for helping to maintain and update and implement your BCMS are no longer available. What are you going to do about that? So this is why this clause was added, because we really wanted to make sure that it was a focus of what the practitioner was doing. Whether or not you go for certification or not, it's really an important aspect. There weren't any changes to 7.1 or 7.2. There was a small change to 7.3, and notice that most of 7.3 is blue text, so we added one bullet. It previously said that you need to be aware of your own role during disruptive incidents. Now it's their own role and responsibilities before, during, and after disruptions. One thing to note is that we changed out disruptive incidents to be just disruptions, just again to make it easier to read. And this idea that it's not just during, it's the before, during, and after that people have responsibilities. Another change that I hope you will like is that we reduced the content under 7.4. What we found was this is where we had the most duplication of requirements. And in fact, almost every bullet that you see here was included under 8.43. So we removed them and essentially said it's all under 8.43. And the text that remains is now blue text. And they added how to communicate. And so there's 4 requirements under the ISO blue text requirement. And we added who will do the communicating. We felt that it was very important that people were assigned the communications. And just to make note, under 7.4, what we're really talking about here are the communications about your BCMS to the people involved in your BCMS, whether mostly internal, but also anybody, your supply chain people, anybody that you rely upon or who relies upon you. So that's what this is about. It's not about your communication during an incident. So even you need to understand, like we asked the question, well, somebody asks you for your business continuity plan. Well, what are you going to give them? This is where you might put this information. How do you respond to requests for information about your program? Who's responsible for doing that communicating? And what's impacted by who the request person is, who's doing the requesting. So this communication is not intended to be about the communication during an incident. It's about the communication about your business continuity management system. And as expected, a lot of this is going to be internal communications. 7.5, there weren't a lot of changes. We only made changes to 7.53, and that was actually made by ISO, and it was blue text that was duplicative that we had to use before. So these 3 bullets were removed, and then they also are given letters and numbers, so we don't have those little hyphen bullets anymore. We actually have A, B, C's, and D's, which makes it easier. So these 3 requirements were all duplicates, as well as this paragraph was a duplicate. So this simplified clause 7.32 as well, or 7.53, and it was actually divided up into 7.531 and 7.532, but there were no new requirements there. It was just reorganizing how it was laid out. So let's take our next poll. Given the changes that you've just seen, how comfortable are you with those changes? Feel okay about them? Are you causing you anxiety about what changes you might have to make in your organization?
All right, the poll is launched and answers are coming in. Linda, you've had a few questions if you want to address any of those.
Sure. I'm going to answer one of the questions, and that is, why does the committee use the term shall, which sounds like as must using consider? And this is a really good question. It's a shall because if you're going to seek certification, you have to do these things. You have to prove that you're doing it. And so while not everyone uses the standard to seek certification, you have to, it is a requirements document. So if you're seeking certification, you have to prove that you're doing each of these things, and that's why it's a shall. The guidance document 22313 says you should do these things. So the guidance document is generally about twice or three times the size of the requirements because they're giving you more and more information and examples about how you might do that. So that's why it says shall. When you see you shall consider, it means that you have to consider this, but you don't have to do it. You can consider it and say we've decided not to do this. So I think there's 2 or 3 places in the standard that says that. And part of the other thing, I just see someone else coming in with a comment that must is stronger than shall. And so one of the things, you can certainly use the word must, but one of the things that's a challenge is that it's not just people who speak English that use the standard. And so everything that's in here, we have to also have checked to make sure that it makes sense in other languages. And that's why representation by as many countries as we can get is really, really important part of writing standards. And then there are some pieces that just, this is the way ISO created this management system standards and how they want it to be, and we just have to follow the process. There is 1% of you that said, go ahead and publish the poll, Brandy. That 1% of you that said you're not comfortable at all, I would really like you to please put in the question poll, the questions, what you're not comfortable about, because this is part of the responsibility that I feel that I have, is to identify how people feel about the changes as well, because we try to get this information out to as many people as possible. Every one of the experts does from every country, but you still don't reach people as much as you would like to. So having an idea of what makes people uncomfortable is really important for us to go with this. All right, I'm going to go ahead and continue. So I'm taking a deep breath now for that 1%. We have a lot of changes to Clause 8, and I think that most, if not all of them, are really for the better. And I have, personally, there's some of the changes that I wanted that didn't get in, and some of the changes that got in that I didn't think were good, that now rethinking it and actually looking at it make a lot more sense to me than they did at first. And this is a learning process for everyone. And so that's one of the reasons for the webinar as well, is to get your feedback on this, as well as to give you an idea that, if you're following this standard, these are the things that are coming. So under 8.2 general, it was general content about the business impact analysis and the risk assessment. In the 2012 version, there were 5 bullets. And what we found is that some of the bullets only related to the risk assessment, and other bullets only related to the business impact analysis, but they were under general. And so it made it very difficult to actually comply with those requirements when you couldn't do them for both. And so the auditors kind of had to say, well, we understand you can't do this. So we really simplified the whole 8.21 to be 2 requirements: that you need to implement and maintain a systematic process for analyzing business impact and assessing risks of disruption. And then the second one, that you need to review the business impact analysis and risk assessment at planned intervals and when there are significant changes within the organization. This requirement got moved from later in the standard, and actually was added right near the end when we were finishing up. And it came from several different comments and things that we realized that, we don't have anything in here about reviewing. We have everything in here about reviewing the program and reviewing the BCMS and all of that, but we don't have anything in here about the importance of reviewing your BIA and your risk assessment results at planned intervals. When teaching, like the lead implementer class, for example, what I have found from students is that some organizations that have a lot of change, they review those results quarterly by department to see if those results are still holding true. Are your RTOs still valid? Are your RPOs still valid? Is our minimum business continuity objective or our capacity level still valid? And have contracts changed and that we need to make adjustments? And so if you don't have a process for doing this. We're now forcing you to have a process for doing this. I know if you follow, some of the other organizations who provide certification, they might say you need to do these things annually. The standard never uses a schedule. What they'll say is periodically or at planned intervals, and we wanted to use planned intervals because we felt that it was stronger than periodically. And we wanted it here under 8.21 and not hidden underneath the other evaluation things, because we wanted to really be clear that you need to do this. So that's the change. And to me, that's a big change for here. And we just simplified the note a little bit as well, just to say you can determine what the order, whether you do the BAA first or the risk assessment first, or however you want to do it. Doesn't really matter, just as long as they're both done and that you use the results of both of those. I do see a hand raised. Not sure if that hand is raised. Maybe if you could put your question in the question box, and I can try to get to it when we do our next poll. So this is the change under 8.21. It's been simplified, but there's been a new requirement added. One thing I wanted to note, in addition to the note that's under here, I already mentioned this one, but also to note is that as far as competencies goes for somebody implementing ISO 22301 or auditing to ISO 22301, we haven't added any new competencies required. We've just added some new requirements to the standard. So just to be clear on that you don't have to learn something brand new and to prove something brand new. You just need to do some new things that you should already know how to do. Under 8.22, there were quite a bit of changes, and there are actually 4 new requirements on how you actually conduct your BIA. This section has gotten more prescriptive. What was found was that companies were getting certified to 22301, and their BIA wasn't very rigorous. And so that was a concern, that we needed to make sure that as a business impact analysis being the cornerstone of your whole business continuity program, that it was rigorous enough. So one of the things that's been added is that you need to define what types of impacts you're planning for and what kind of criteria that you're using. The next bullet's the same as it was. And then you need to take those impact types and your criteria in order to assess the impacts over time of disruption from these activities. So what they want to see is a very close tie from your assessment tied to those impact types and the criteria. So the criteria you might talk about being your questions, for example. I don't have time in this webinar to teach you what we mean by these things, but just to tell you what the changes are. Letter D was a requirement before, but they've added the note that this might be referred to as MTPD. And letter E was also the same requirement, but they've added the note that this might be referred to as a recovery time objective. You might ask why they're put in this order, and it was the technical expert's opinion that as many companies are not using MTPD, that people really need to understand that you need to understand when an outage is intolerable to you, and make sure that your RTO is within that time frame. And so it's the opinion of the experts that your MTPD would be identified first, and then you'd build your RTO within that. And that's why they have it kind of in this order. Like I said, this is much more prescriptive than it was before, so these things would actually probably be done in this order. And then after the new requirement, you need to use this analysis to identify your prioritized activities, to put them in prioritized order. And then letters G and H are really just 2 bullets that used to be 1 long sentence, but there's no new requirements there. So B, D, E, G, and H are from the previous version, and what you see in yellow are the new requirements. Contrary to the business impact analysis, the risk assessment clause was actually made a little bit leaner and a little bit just modified slightly. The reason for this is that risk assessment and that risk assessment process is owned outside of ISO 22301. And so conducting a risk assessment, we did not want to be prescriptive here because organizations conduct risk assessments all the time. And all we did was say that you can look at ISO 31000 as an example of how to do this, but you need to have a systematic risk assessment process that identifies the risks of disruptions to the organized, prioritized activities and the required resources. You need to analyze and evaluate those risks and then determine which risks require treatments. They did add the note here that risks in this subclause refer to the disruption to business activities and that the other risks related to the effectiveness of your management system are in 6.1. Just as a reminder, they've got that in 6.1 that we're talking about 8.23 for this type of risk, and so we're just making those notes back and forth so that people have an understanding of the purpose for each one of those. And then there was a fourth requirement in the 2012 version, which talked about doing risk treatment. And because there's not a real differentiator line between risk treatment and putting together your strategies and solutions, we just moved risk treatment to 8.3. So the other big change, there's several big changes under Clause 8. So I guess this is really the meat of the things that you need to understand. Clause 8.3 was business continuity strategy with kind of a capital S being a singular strategy. And this has created challenges for people globally in their implementation as well as their audits. And so what we've done is we've changed it to business continuity strategies and solutions. And so what we're looking at here is you've got an overall business continuity strategy, like we want to continue operations to meet our requirements. So whatever that is, that's your overall strategy. And that capital S strategy is supported by different strategies, like what are our alternate work locations? What are our resource relocations? And then you're going to have specific solutions for each strategy, such as you might work remotely or you might have an alternate workplace to meet your alternate work locations, or you might transfer work to another location for a resource relocation, or you might, change over your data centers or change over your call centers or whatever it is that you're doing. So these three concepts, that the capital letter S for the overall strategy is now being talked about as different strategies that are then tied to specific solutions to meet those strategies. Under 8.31 general, before it talked about stabilizing, it talked about protecting, stabilizing, continuing, recovering, mitigating, and responding to. We've really replaced all of that with this sentence. Based on the outputs from the BIA and the risk assessment was there before, and what we've added, the organization shall identify and select business continuity strategies, in plural, that consider options for before, during, and after disruption. The business continuity strategy should be comprised of one or more solutions. So for every strategy you have to have a solution to each one, at least one solution, and you'd hope that you might have multiple solutions for them. As you're building a more robust business continuity management system, that might be one of the ways that you show continual improvement is to increase the number of solutions available to you. The other thing that we are, so I just got a note that the recording has stopped, so I'm going to see if, I'm not sure if it's recording on mine, so just for those of you that want to view this again, I'll re-record it if we need to. So when you're looking at 8.32, identification of strategies and solutions, this was now divided into two parts to help it be more readable. The first these are all new requirements. You need to meet the requirements to continue and recover your prioritized activities within the identified timeframes and capacity. You also need a course to protect the organization's prioritized activities. This was in 8.32 previously. Reduce the likelihood of disruption, shorten the period of disruption, and limit the impact of disruption of the organization's products and services. This was under 8.33 previously. And then a new requirement is to provide for the availability of adequate resources. So just streamline this process a little bit. It was a little bit unclear about what was meant, and in fact, in the guidance document, there was so much guidance on it, it was really clear that we hadn't done a very good job in the requirements piece for people to understand what we meant. The second part is under 8.33, selection of strategies and solutions. So again, when you're selecting it, you need to do the same thing that you did under identification. They need to meet the requirements. So that's going to be a duplicate requirement in 2 different clauses that you need to be able to show, and it's done here intentionally. You need to consider the amount and type of risk the organization may or may not take. So looking at risk appetite again, there's no sense in you selecting a strategy or a solution that doesn't meet your risk appetite of your organization. And of course, you need to consider associated costs and benefits. And I think this is something that you might find helpful to have that in there. The word consider, associated costs. You know, if something costs you too much and you don't get enough benefit out of it, you're not going to select it. And this gives you an out, especially if you're looking for certification, to say, we considered this option, we were unable to implement because of the costs associated with it compared to the benefits. Under 8.34 resource requirements, the term solutions was added in here. And really the only changes made was under letters C and D. What we found is it was confusing for people that C and D weren't different enough. So we put everything that's inside, that's part of the building, under C, and anything that's inside a building would be letter D, and then added logistics to that. We also added a brand new clause under 8.35 that you actually need to implement your solutions. So you need to implement and maintain your selected business continuity solutions so they can be activated when needed. Kind of closes out the 8.3 section. Moving to 8.4, business continuity plans and procedures. We modified this text, and I'm not going to say it's a new requirement, but it's really rewriting the old requirement to be a little bit easier to understand. And then, of course, with the word solutions in there, we had to modify that as well. So you need, and it really produces a summary of what needs to be in your business continuity plans and procedures. So it's introducing the rest of it as an introduction. So the organization shall implement and maintain a response structure that will enable timely warning and communication to relevant interested parties and provide plans and procedures to manage the organization during a disruption. The plans and procedures shall be used when required to activate your business continuity solution. So here they're making a direct tie that whatever your strategies and solutions are, they need to be documented in your plans and procedures. Strangely enough, I've personally seen plans that don't have anything to do with your strategies, which makes you wonder where the plans were developed from and what template was used. Filling out a template's great if you have a software tool or something, but it needs to be tied to the output of your BIA and your risk assessment and the output of your strategies and solutions. So you need to identify and document business continuity plans and procedures based on the output of your selected strategies and solutions. And the note here is that there are different types of procedures that comprise the business continuity plans, giving you, the fact that they're not going to look the same from organization to organization or even from department to department. With this change, we're really trying to draw attention to the purpose of the plans and procedures and making sure that they're tied to that output, like I mentioned before. In general, the procedures all need to be specific. They need to be flexible, focus on the impact, and be effective. Those were all the same as before. And we added assigned roles and responsibilities for tasks within it. 2 requirements were removed. Because this is communications. We've got communications under 7.4 and 8.43, and be developed on stated assumptions we felt was already identified. So those 2 requirements were removed and replaced with the letter E. Under 8.42, incident response structure was changed to just response structure. And again, we provided some headers so that we could reference better. So you need to maintain a structure identifying 1 or more teams. Here is where we really got specific. In the old standard, or the 2012 version, there was no reference to teams. And this was something that was just overlooked. We talked about having one or more persons responsible. We never really talked about teams and the importance of teams. So what you're going to see in 8.42, 3, and 4 is a focus on teams. And the roles and responsibilities of each team and the relationships between the teams need to be clearly stated. So these are two new requirements. These were made to improve readability, but remember, we really wanted you to be looking at this management structure needs to be tied to teams. Collectively, this is the word collectively, so it doesn't mean each team, it means collectively. Each team needs to be competent, or the teams need to be competent to do each one of these things. The only new thing is letter D, that plan actions that need to be undertaken. And when you're establishing priorities, you're supposed to use life safety as the first priority. So I'm going to qualify that by saying, if your business continuity management system does not include life safety, it's being done by some other part of your organization, then you did not need to use life safety as your first priority. You just point to the other part of your organization that manages that. What we're seeing globally is about 50% of organizations. The BCMS does not include life safety, but of course then 50% does. And so the experts felt that it needed to be in here. So as of right now, it is included in it, and I'm assuming it will be published that way in 2019. Then they go on to talk about, for each team there shall be identified personnel and alternates, and then documented procedures to guide their actions. So here is where they're being very specific as to what each team needs to have in that. And I would argue with you that if you're not doing those two things with your teams, what are you doing? So these, to me, these seem pretty basic. The new content focuses on the roles and responsibilities of those assigned teams. So I'm not going to go through the requirements under 8.43, warning and communication, because there really aren't any changes. We removed requirements that were already, under 8.42. We moved communication requirements that were in 8.44 to 8.43, and then we just divided them into two parts and added a note to make it easier to read. So the note says that the organization may document and maintain procedures for how and under what circumstances the organization communicates with employees and their emergency contacts. And here's where you see the word, anything in a note is not a requirement. It's, that you might want to consider doing this. Under 8.4 for business continuity plans, I just wanted to compare the 2012 kind of introductory statement with the 2019. So you can see that we've got document and maintain business continuity plans and procedures. The business continuity plan shall provide guidance and information to assist teams to respond to a disruption and to assist the organization with response and recovery. So it doesn't really change the actual requirement, it's just written a little bit nicer. The plans themselves, the requirements for the plans, as I mentioned, all of the requirements for communicating have been removed. And the word teams was added to letter A. Details on the actions that the teams will take in order to do these things. Otherwise, the rest of the requirements are pretty much the same. The only addition is to letter D, and this was sort of hard-pressed. It says details to manage the immediate consequences of a disruption, giving due regard to, which is a little bit interesting. It's kind of like a shall consider statement. The welfare of individuals. So if your incident and your plans include life safety, you're going to need to address that. Of course, prevention of further loss or unavailability of prioritized activities. But 3, the impact on the environment. So if your organization's response to an incident, when you activate your business continuity plans, is going to have a negative impact on the environment, you're supposed to give due regard to that. I'm just going to leave it at that. This is one that's a little bit harder for me to explain. Each plan shall include, this is basically, again, the same as it was before. It has letters and numbers, so it's easier to reference. The only thing added here is letter C, actions and resources to implement solutions, and making sure that each plan is usable and available at the time and place where it's required. Under 8.5, the exercise program, most of the bullets and requirements are exactly the same, with the exception of letter C. We've added that you need to develop teamwork, competence, confidence, and knowledge for those who have roles to perform in relation to disruptions. Letter D, they just struck out the whole of, just so it says taken over time, validate its business continuity strategies, and then they added and solutions. And then as a summary sentence, the organization shall act on the results of its exercising and testing to implement changes and improvements, which you would hopefully be doing that anyways, and it is inferred that you do that in 9.1, but we wanted it included here under 8.5. Our last really big change, and one which I'm actually think is somewhat genius, never really occurred to me, but we moved 9.12 almost in its entirety and moved it under 8.6. So remember, I've been talking about having your business continuity management system requirements versus your business continuity requirements. And the intention of moving it from 9, which kind of is like the management of your system, into the management of your program, is that we wanted to make sure that just like we added the BIA and the risk assessment needing to be reviewed at planned intervals, the outcomes of those, we wanted the business continuity documentation and capabilities evaluated regularly. So A, B, and C are exactly how they were before. We moved letter D, conduct evaluations of the business continuity capabilities of relevant partners and suppliers, from 8.3. And we added letter E after an incident or activation in there, and then, of course, update the documentation and procedures in a timely manner. So not really any new requirements, just the change of its location. So let's take our next poll, which is how comfortable are you with the changes made to Clause 8?
All right, that poll was launched. In the meantime, Linda, you have a lot of questions pouring in.
All right, let me take a look. I have a lot of people commenting on the must and the shall. A couple comments from people saying that understanding the language, and the question is, are the changes making, or more generic, making the ISO more globally relevant? I hope that this ISO standard is globally relevant, but I also hope that the language that we're using, kind of the plain English language, is going to be helpful. Another question talks about delaying the project. They're doing trying to do an ISO 22301 project with delaying the project. I would say that you probably don't need to delay. I mean, I'm not going to tell you that you can just use what we've shared here, but it might be helpful to use some of what's in the webinar to help you with that. Another question has to do with the gap on impact types. And this is where I would say rely on the guidance document. Our curriculum identifies impact types like impact to your people, impact to your facility, impact to your supply chain, impact to your reputation, and impact to your financial, to the overall organization. And there might be a couple of more. So I think, what they're trying to say is the standard isn't going to tell you what you want to use for impacts, but you need to identify what they are. And the ones I just mentioned are pretty standard across the industry. The other question is, how does MTB different from maximum allowable downtime? They're really the same. And in 2012 version, they have the exact same definition. ISO's trying to move to just having one, and I know there's actually maximum allowable outage too. There's a question here about the adaptive BC organization, and I'm actually going to be writing a little bit of a blog that has something to do with that, so I'm not going to comment on that here because it's too big of a topic. I will say that if you're doing a business continuity program and you don't have a BIA and you're not reviewing it in a timely manner, I don't know what you're doing, because those things are really, really important. I'm only going to answer one more question. It says, is ITDR considered a separate from BCMS in the standard? And this is a really good question. When I looked at the companies that were certified to ISO 22301, more than 60% of them are certifying their ITDR and their IT programs of their data centers. So by far, more companies are using the standard to certify their IT part of their organization than not. Any other questions I'll try to answer afterwards, because we are running a little bit short on time. So Brandy's sharing the results. I'm really, really excited to see that 50% of you are comfortable with these changes. And again, if those of you that have some concerns, if you could please, either put it in the questions pane or send me an email, and I'd be happy to try to address your concerns, as well as share that with the leadership people. Just to finish up, we're just about finished. Clause 9.1, we just removed all the text that's not required. So it's all we did was add in C and D, and when you need to do it and by whom. So who's going to be assigned to do it, and when you're going to share those results and who shares those results. So we moved everything else that wasn't required. And like I said, we moved 9.12 to 8.6. We also simplified 9.2 under internal audit. Everything in those two paragraphs was also in the bullets, so we just removed those. And then we made it a little bit easier to read. The management review section had input and output. So the only two new requirements under input is that we really want you to use the information from the business impact analysis and risk assessment, and output from your evaluation of what you do in 8.6. So when you're bringing your management review to management, some of the things that you need to be doing is including your evaluation of your current documentation and capabilities, in addition to everything else that's been listed here since 2012. The outputs, all we really did was add to letter B that you need to, that you should probably see maybe changes to your business continuity strategies and solutions. And the purpose of the output is to improve its efficiency and effectiveness. And we got rid of all the extra text. So 1 through 8 went to the guidance document. So we have fewer requirements there. And we'll just do our last poll. How did you feel about changes to Clause 9? Actually, I'm hoping everybody is happy with this, because it is made it there are much fewer requirements in Clause 9. It should be very easy. All right, just for time factor, Brandy, if you want to just go ahead and share that poll.
Sure thing. Poll is up.
All right, looks like people are pretty comfortable. That makes me really happy. Just some of the questions that were asked. If you want to learn more, ICOR does have the Implementing ISO 22301 course and certification, as well as our ANSI accredited lead auditor. If you are currently certified as a lead implementer, your certification is still valid. And of course, when you do your updates, some of the requirements might be realigned for what you need to do for your updates. And for the lead auditor certificate, we will be having an e-learning course that will essentially follow very similar to this webinar, where we will identify those changes, and you'll just have a short multiple choice and a couple of maybe short answer questions in order to get your certificate updated for the 2019 version. And just to let you know, a reminder that we have our next webinars coming up rather quickly on the Agile organization. So we're going to be looking at resilience and what makes an organization more or less agile, followed by building resilient communities. If you have any questions, go ahead and you can send me a personal email or contact our office, and we'd be happy to get back to you. Thank you very much for your time today. Appreciate it. And as a reminder, you'll all get a certificate of attendance as well. Thank you.